evening, and welcome back to our read-along of Diana Gabaldon's Outlander. We are on Chapter 2, so we haven't gotten very far, but Chapter 2 is called Standing Stones, and it starts with Claire meeting Mr. Crook again. And so one of my predictions from previously was not correct. I predicted we wouldn't see Mr. Crook again, but we did. So Mr. Crook and Claire are going for a leisurely ramble throughout the countryside with the express purpose of going to look for different plants. Mr. Crook was the one who gave her these flower presses. Claire shared her love of botany with him, and they became fast friends. But I also think it's really funny that Frank is allowing Claire, and I say allowing Claire because who knows, he may not know that she's meeting up with Mr. Crook. That I think it's funny that Frank is allowing Claire to meet up with these random guys, especially the night before he was insinuating that she had an affair during the time they were apart. So he was concerned then, but he's not concerned now as he's going off doing all of his research and studies that she's hanging out with random men. I mean, maybe Mr. Crook doesn't pose that much of a threat to Frank, but still. So Mr. Crook and Claire are going about the countryside looking for plants, and Mr. Crook is the one who introduces her to Craignadoon, which obviously we know that plays a big part in the rest of the story. But he says, "Look, I wanted to show you, here's Craignadoon." And she's like, "Really? Is there something special about it?" "Oh, aye," he answered, but refused to elaborate further, merely saying that I'd see when I saw. So they walk up the path, and they're investigating and looking around Craignadoon. And Claire, these are not the first standing stones that Claire has encountered. Before the war, she and Frank had been to Salisbury Plain and seen Stonehenge. So she gives a little recount of their trip to Stonehenge. Claire talks about some of the things that the guide at Stonehenge said about the possible uses of Stonehenge. Was it a place for a good burial ground, a temple, a place for human sacrifices, whatnot? And Claire mentions that out of the same passion for exactness that made Frank adjust his ties on the hanger so that the ends, Claire says, out of the same passion for exactness that made Frank adjust his ties on the hanger so that the ends hung precisely even, we'd even trekked around the circumference of the circle, pacing off the distance between the Z-holes and the Y-holes, and counting the lintels in the sarsen circle, the outermost ring of monstrous uprights. So this little tidbit about the nature of Frank, there's this whole theory that whenever Claire goes back to the 20th century, that Frank knew about this the whole time. Like, he was aware that Jamie was alive, that he had survived Culloden, that he had used whatever historical research skills. Obviously, he was very familiar with that time period, considering he's looking at history of Black Jack Randall, who was Jamie's contemporary and knew Jamie, that he had certainly come across this information about Jamie, and he seems to be a very exacting scholar, as we see evidenced in some of the things here in this chapter that we'll get to. So the fact that his wife comes back from being gone, disappeared into time and space for 2 years, and comes back, he's just gonna take it at face value and be like, "Oh, she came back. I wonder what happened." Like, even if he is practical, I think he would have taken what his wife said and investigated it, put his scholarly research skills to the test. That's what I think. So she's talking about the possible purposes for Stonehenge, and she talks about her favorite suggestion was that it was an open-air market. I like this last suggestion, visualizing megalithic housewives strolling between the lintels, baskets on their arms, critically judging the glaze on the latest shipment of red clay beakers and listening skeptically to the claims of Stone Age bakers and vendors of deer bone shovels and amber beads. So once again, this is imagery of a home, similar to the blue vase that she was looking at. So home Home and a house, and perhaps a family are on Claire's mind. So she flashes forward to her and Mr. Crook at Craignadoon walking around, looking at some of the standing stones. She's talking about how some of them have like stripes and different coloring and speckled with flakes of mica that caught the morning sun. And she's like, Frank would be fascinated. He'd be fascinated to come here. I will bring him to see it later. So she finishes her afternoon with Mr. Crook. She swung down the road that afternoon toward the village to fetch Frank from the vicarage. She finds out that Frank and the vicar are knee-deep in a bunch of news, and they're so excited to tell Claire. But it was news from around 1750. Not precisely stop the presses then, she says. Yes, indeed. We've been tracing your husband's ancestor, Jack Randall, through the army dispatches of the period. But she humors them and is like, tell me, tell me. Yes, indeed. We've been tracing your husband's ancestor, Jack Randall, through the army dispatches of the period. The vicar leaned close, speaking out of the side of his mouth like a gangster in an American film. I've borrowed the original dispatches from the local historical society files. You'll be careful not to tell anyone. And amused, I agreed that I would not reveal his deadly secret, and looked about for a comfortable chair in which to receive the latest revelations from the 18th century. And then I think it's interesting that Claire settles down to listen to news of the day, the latest revelations from the 18th century, the latest revelations from the 18th century. And little does she know that she should pay close attention to these revelations from the 18th century, because they soon will become front-page news in her eyes. So some funny things here. This is the second incident of a person who is doing something kind of uncharacteristic of them. So you have Mrs. Baird, who is like this nice, kindly innkeeper, church-going woman who is sacrificing black roosters on her doorstep as a way to appease the old gods. Then you have the vicar, who is a man of the cloth, a religious leader, stealing documents from the Historical Society. All right, so interesting. So you have people being out of character. But as she's settling down to hear what Frank and the vicar have found, we are introduced to one of my favorite characters in the entire book series, young Roger. The vicar, coming to assist me, was as surprised as I. The boy, startled out of sleep, shot bolt upright. Now what are you up to in here, you young scamp? The vicar was scolding affectionately. Oh, you fell asleep reading the comic papers again. Run along, Roger. I have business with the Randalls. Oh, wait, I've forgotten to introduce you. Mrs. Randall, this is my son, Roger. So we soon find out that Roger is the Reverend Wakefield niece's son. Father shot down over the channel and mother killed in the Blitz. So I've taken him. How kind of you, I murmured, thinking of Uncle Lamb. He, too, had died in the Blitz, killed by a hit to the auditorium of the British Museum where he had been lecturing. So I think this is interesting because Claire is an orphan who was raised by her uncle, and Roger is an orphan who is raised by his uncle. So we have the first two incidences of orphans, which I think is a big theme in the book. So I feel like Claire and Roger connect over the fact that they were orphaned and raised by uncles. So Roger scampers off, and Frank begins to talk about his most amazing luck. The vicar's located a whole series of military dispatches that mention Jonathan Randall. Okay, so Frank, I think this is so funny. Like, Frank is just so enamored with all of this historical stuff. His wife is gallivanting around the Highlands with other men and doing things. Frank is insinuating that she had an affair during the war, but he doesn't want to hang out with her during their honeymoon because he's studying history. So they talk about what they know about Frank Randall, and that he probably had a patron, the Duke of Sandringham, and that, to make a long story short, Captain Randall was probably an agent provocateur who went about the countryside trying to, dig out Jacobites and figure out who was against the crown. which is interesting. We find out that's probably what is going on. But Claire isn't very interested in this, so Mrs. Graham, whenever she comes in to bring the afternoon tea, decides to rescue Claire and says, hey, come on into the kitchen. We can do lady things there. And lo and behold, as soon as they decide to have tea, we have another character kind of stepping out of character and being unpredictable in a mystical way. So Mrs. Graham is like, hey, have some tea, but finish up quickly so I can do a tea reading on you. And Claire's like, what? You read tea leaves, I asked, mildly amused. Nothing could be farther from the popular conception of the gypsy fortune teller than Mrs. Graham, with her short iron gray perm and triple-stranded pearl choker. Why, certainly I do, my dear, just as my grandmother taught me and her grandmother before her. Drink up, and I'll see what you have there. All right, so Claire drinks and is like, here's my cup, read my future. Mrs. Graham says, that's one of the stranger ones I've seen. Oh, am I going to meet a tall, dark stranger or journey across the sea? Well, 2 out of the 3 of those things. He was tall and she journeyed across the sea. I wouldn't say that he was dark, though. Could be. Mrs. Graham had caught my ironic tone and echoed it. And could not. That's what's odd about your cup, my dear. Everything in it's contradictory. There's the curved leaf for a journey, but it's crossed by the broken one that means staying put. And strangers there are, to be sure, several of them, and one of them's your husband, if I read the leaves aright. All right. So you have this inconclusive tea reading, which I suppose, like, to Diana's credit, she was writing this book as practice. And so it kind of makes sense that you have this inconclusive prophecy in a way. So if you do continue the series, you can really go any way you want. But here it's like there's a journey, but there might not be a journey. And you might be going somewhere, or you're staying put. Or there's strangers, and then there's not strangers. And then to make things even crazier, she's like, hey, let me read your palm, Claire. And Claire's like, okay. It's not your fate. It's not your fate is in your hand, only the seed of it, Mrs. Graham says. The lines in your hand change, you know. At another point in your life, they may be quite different than they are now. I didn't know that. I thought you were born with them, and that was that, says Claire. I was repressing an urge to jerk my hand away. What's the point of palm reading, then? Yeah, like, what's the point of palm reading if you're just going to give us this arbitrary reading? And this reading seems to support any type of interpretation. So Mrs. Graham is like, well, the lines of your palm show what you are, dear. Okay, so it's not predicting your future or telling us what your life is going to be like. It just kind of is a personality test, I'm guessing. But then the lines change. So you have a personality test in your palm. So what am I then, according to my hand? And Mrs. Graham frowned. I cannot just say. Okay, Mrs. Graham, you are not being helpful. Not being helpful whatsoever. So, but this is what Mrs. Graham says about Claire, the type of person Claire is. You're strong-minded and have a will not easily crossed. Reckon your husband could have told you that, likewise about that one. Then she pointed to the fleshy mound at the base of the thumb. What is it? The Mount of Venus, it's called. In a man, you'd say it means he likes the lasses. For a woman, 'tis a bit different. To be polite about it, I'll make a bit of a prediction for you and say your husband isn't like to stray far from your bed. And she gave a surprisingly deep and bodied chuckle, and I blushed slightly. Okay, knowing what we know about Claire, this is a good personality study. Now there's a well-marked lifeline. You're in good health and likely to stay so. The lifeline's interrupted, meaning your life's changed markedly. Well, that's true for all of us. Well, considering they've gone through a war, okay. But yours is more chopped up than I usually see, all bits and pieces. And your marriage line now, it's divided. That's not unusual. It means 2 marriages. Uh-oh. Now Claire viscerally reacts to that one. Like, 2 marriages? And so she squinted nearsightedly at my palm, running a short, rigid nail gently down the deep marriage line. But most divided lines are broken. Yours is forked. Okay. So instead of it being like a line and then it breaks and then another line, it's like a line and then it goes into two. That's a little bit of foreshadowing, a little bit of prediction. Might be a little bit heavy-handed, but you got to do what you got to do to get the plot going. Then she asks about the small marks. Claire asks, I've heard that small marks on the side of the hand indicate how many children you'll have. My tone was casual, I hoped. The edge of my palm was disappointingly smooth. And then Mrs. Graham is like, proves nothing if the side of your hand is smooth. Proves nothing. And then Claire was relieved to hear this because obviously there's a lot of in the book about family and house, like the vase, thinking about the open air market at Stonehenge, and now she's asking about children during the palm reading. So I think she wants kids. But in comes the vicar and destroys this strange little fortune-telling scene we have. And they're like, come back into the study. We're going to talk about Jack Randall. And so Claire's like, okay. So she goes in there preparing that she is going to have to fake excitement about this. And she enters, and Frank was so absorbed in the tattered documents that he scarcely looked up when I entered the study. Okay, if he is so absorbed in these documents from the 1750s, he has to know about Jamie. If he can get absorbed into something about blackjack, he can get absorbed in documents about some other guy from the 1700s. So they're talking about blackjack. This is whenever we learn that he's notorious, a gallant soldier for the crown, an agent provocateur. Essentially, seems like he was paid by the Duke of Sandringham to be an ass and go around torturing the Scottish people. So Frank is over there perusing these documents, studying them carefully, talking about blackjack, his illustrious ancestor, and Claire is wandering around the study and comes across this genealogical chart for Roger, the little boy that she just met, Roger W. Mackenzie Wakefield. And the vicar explains, I want my son to know I want Roger to know where he came from. I'm doing his genealogical chart so he knows and he remembers. And I gave him my own name because it seemed more suitable as he lives here, but I didn't want him to forget where he came from. I'm afraid my own family is nothing to boast of genealogically. Right. So they leave the vicarage. They're going home. Frank is just overjoyed with all this new information about Frank Randall, and he isn't really paying attention to the fact that Claire is silent. So he's like, what is it? Are you not feeling well? And Claire's like, well, I was only thinking. I hesitated because we had discussed this matter before. I was thinking about Roger. Roger? I gave a sigh of impatience. Really, Frank, you can be so oblivious. Roger, the Reverend Wakefield's son. Oh, yes, of course, he said vaguely. Charming child. What about him? Well, only that there are a lot of children like that. Orphaned, And I can't help but she's thinking about if they can't have children, she probably wants to adopt. And secondly, she's an orphan herself. So she probably is seeing a little bit of herself in Roger and thinking about her situation. He gave me a sharp look and shook his head. No, Claire, really I'd like to, but I've told you how I feel about adoption. It's just, I couldn't feel properly toward a child that's not of my blood. No doubt that's ridiculous and selfish of me, but there it is. Maybe I'll change my mind in time, but now. So, interesting. Foreshadowing. And I do wonder how much of this did Diana know that she was going to eventually write. I know she says she didn't sketch out a big plot of how the books were going to go. But despite Frank talking about this, he later essentially does take on an adoptive father role with Brianna. I mean, that child was not of his blood, and he seemed to love her and care for her as if she was his own. So whether he liked it or not, it happened. I'm afraid a child from outside, one we had no real relationship with, would seem an intruder and I'd resent it. So she kind of puts the topic to rest and is kind of like, okay, whatever, I'm not getting anywhere near here. And Frank's like, I love you. Let's go have sex. He didn't exactly say that, but he did say that he loved you. He did say that he loved her. And then he's like, we haven't given up yet, have we? I smiled back at Claire. No. Game for another try? Why not? And then they're heading back to the bed and breakfast with love on the brain. And Claire sees a random standing stone at the corner of the road there and is like, she's like, hey, I forgot I was going to tell you about those standing stones that are up at Craignadoon. I have to... Oh my gosh. Okay, I was just reading this. Did not even realize this the first time. Okay, game for another try. So they're talking about a roll in the hay. Yes, why not? We strolled hand in hand back toward the Gareside Road. It was the site of the Barragh Moor, the picture stone that stands at the corner of the road there that made me remember things ancient. I forgot, I exclaimed. I have something exciting to show you. Frank looked down at me and pulled me closer. He squeezed my hand. So have I, he said, grinning. You can show me yours tomorrow. I just got that he was talking about. Okay. Then we segue to a part of the story. They are taking a day trip to Loch Ness. The legends that surround the cryptic loch. And they talk about the Loch Ness Monster itself and some legends around there. And then, because we're talking about mystical things like Loch Ness, and there's a segue in the conversation once they get back to Mrs. Baird's house. Frank's like, I'm setting the alarm clock. And Claire's like, why are we setting the alarm clock? Frank's like, to see the witches. Okay, we go from talking about the Loch Ness Monster to talking about witches, but you're in the Highlands, so what do you expect? Who told you that there are witches? The vicar, Frank answered. Once again, we have a man of the cloth talking about witches. The vicar, Frank answered, clearly enjoying the joke. His housekeeper is one of them. I thought of the dignified Mrs. Graham and snorted derisively. Don't be ridiculous. Well, not witches exactly. There have been witches all over Scotland for hundreds of years. They burnt them till well into the 18th century. More foreshadowing about what happens to Claire in the future. In the past. In the future books. Okay, so they get up early the next day to go see the witches at Craignadoon. And one thing about Frank, he is never tired. He is going to see various researchers throughout the area. He leaves early in the morning to go do research. Claire comes over to say hey, and he's not even looking up from his research. He's setting alarm clocks to wake up early in the morning. I mean, Claire is, stumbling around, stepping on rocks and is freezing cold, and Frank's like running up the hill, analyzing the rocks. Beautiful, he murmured. He crept silently to the outer edge of the ring, his shadowy figure disappearing among the larger shadows of the stones. Frank was back in a moment. No one here yet, he whispered. Come on, I found a place we can watch them from. I'm like, does this guy ever rest? Does he ever sleep? He's always like researching and doing history things. But then, with all his slinking around in the darkness and stones, Claire wonders, not for the first time, just what kind of work Frank had done during the war. He certainly seemed to know a lot about maneuvering soundlessly in the dark. I bet he was a spy. Wonder if we ever know. So they are hanging out by Craignadoon. It's Beltane, so it's in May, the spring. And they're about to watch some modern-day druids, many of whom they've already met in the town. So Mrs. Graham, there's Mrs. Buchanan, who's the postmistress. There's other people that Claire have seen about town. And she watches them all come up in their regular street clothes, and then they go hide behind the rocks, get dressed into white dresses. The sun comes up and they're all doing some kind of dance. Mrs. Graham seems to be the ringleader of everyone. And Frank and Claire are kind of crouched down in secret watching this this go on. And as the sun rose above the horizon, its light flooded between the eastern stones, knifed between the halves of the circle, and struck the great split stone on the opposite side of the henge. Keep that in mind, split stone. So the sun rises, Mrs. Graham yells in some foreign language, and that's obviously signs that their ceremony is over. Everyone packs up and goes, except Mrs. Graham. She comes back and she lights a cigarette. She's going to take some time for herself before going back to the vicarage. And so Frank's bummed that he can't go digging around the stones anymore, and Claire's kind of bummed because whenever she was up there with Mr. Crook hanging out the other day, she saw some botanical specimen that she wants. I did see an interesting plant growing near the base of one of the tall stones. It had orange centers and deep blue flowers. And so she has her mind on that, but right now they can't go do that. But seeing this ceremony definitely gives Frank enough fodder for research and scholarly thinking for like the next chapter. So even as they're walking down the hill, he's already absorbed in the details of the ceremonies, quizzing Claire relentlessly on the way down the path, urging her to remember as closely as I could the exact wording of the calls, the timing of the dance. Norse, he said at last. The root words are ancient Norse, I'm almost sure of it, but the dance is very much older. Not that there aren't Viking circle dances, he said, but that shifting pattern with the double line business, and it's like some of the patterns on the beaker folk glazeware show a pattern rather like that, and then again. So he's full of scholarly knowledge, essentially verbally writing out all of his observations. But then they trip on a sardine can, and it essentially brings them back to modern day, and he and Claire end up having sex in the cow parsley. The next section is they are back in the parlor at the bed and breakfast. Claire is looking at a botanical book, trying to find an illustration of the flower that she wants to get up at Craignadoon. And Frank's like, well, why don't you go up there and get it? But once you go up there and get it, can you check and see if there are any traces of fire around the circle? Because Beltane is a fire ceremony, but we didn't see any fire. So were they really doing a Beltane ritual? But the next time you go up there, can you please just look for signs of fire for me? Thanks, babe. So she's like, all right, I will do that. So the next day she gets up, goes up to the Craignadoon circle, and has quite the experience. The tallest stone of the circle was cleft, with a vertical split dividing the two massive pieces. Though you could see that the facing surfaces matched, they were separated by a gap of 2 or 3 feet. So what pulled this stone apart? There was a deep humming noise coming from somewhere near at hand. I thought there might be a beehive lodged in some crevice of the rock, and placed a hand on the stone in order to lean into the cleft. The stone screamed. I backed away as fast as I could, moving so quickly that I tripped on the short turf and sat down hard. I stared at the stone, sweating. I had never heard such a sound from anything living. There was no way to describe it, except to say that it was the sort of scream you might expect from a stone. It was horrible. The other stones began to shout. There was a noise of battle and the cries of dying men and shattered horses. I shook my head violently to clear it, but the noise went on. I stumbled to my feet and staggered toward the edge of the circle. The sounds were all around me, making my teeth ache and my head spin. My vision began to blur. I do not know now whether I went toward the cleft in the main stone, or whether it was accidental, a blind drifting through the fog of noise. So then she starts trying to describe what happened to her, and she likens it to feeling weightless in the middle of a car accident, lulled by the noise and motion into an illusion. I could say that my field of vision contracted to a single dark spot, then disappeared altogether, leaving not darkness but a bright void. I can say that I felt as though I were spinning or as though I were being pulled inside out. And all these things are true, yet none of them conveys the sense I had of complete disruption, of being slammed very hard against something that wasn't there. The truth is that nothing moved, nothing changed, nothing whatever appeared to happen, and yet I experienced a feeling of elemental terror so great that I lost all sense of who or what or where I was. I was in the heart of chaos, and no power of mind or body was of use against it. So she doesn't know if she passed out. It seems like she did. She isn't experiencing many of the typical traits of passing out. So she woke up and stumbled on a rock near the bottom of the hill, and she was like sliding and running down the hill. I felt sick and dizzy and crawled toward a stand of oak saplings and leaned against one to steady myself. There was a confused noise of shouting nearby, which reminded me of the sounds I had heard and felt in the stone circle. The ring of inhuman violence was lacking, though. This was the normal sound of human conflict, and I turned toward it. So that is the end of chapter 2. So it took 2 chapters for her to enter the past, because chapter 3, The Man in the Wood, she's in the past now. But she doesn't know it yet. What happens next?